This is the outline that we're going to go through. It has to do with their creation. This is a systematic study. You get into the Bible, you start looking at Israel, which is who we're looking at. We see that they're created. We've seen that they have been chosen by God. They've been called by God unto himself to be his witnesses. We are now in their covenants that God makes with them. By the way, God always says that he does everything he does based upon the covenant structure with his people, and you'll see that. And he links that covenant structure back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not to the covenant of works, not to the doctrine of the atonement or any of that. But we're looking at the covenants, and we've looked at the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, and we're still getting into some of those things. And then we'll look at their chastening, their conversion, and their kingdom. Now that seems somewhat easy, but I do know that this is difficult for some people, and I'll tell you why. And I was hoping the majority of people would be here, but the Lord has here who he wants here. So what we're going to do is I want to show you the difference between dispensational premillennialism, which is what I'm teaching, and historic premillennialism. All right? So remember, when we were looking at these, the proponents or the people who teach dispensational premillennialism would be up there: Schofield, Louis Ferry Schaeffer, Wolver, Charles Ryrie, MacArthur, and many other people that you know and you're familiar with. That would be the dispensational perspective. But now, I don't know how long you've been here, but that is not what you would hear taught from here. We've been here about 10 years, and there's not really any sermon that I can tell you that I heard that would tell me this is a historic premillennial church. Okay? Now, this is for your learning. This is for your benefit. Okay? So I hope that you'll pay attention. And what I want you to see is that there is a huge difference between a dispensational perspective, what I'm giving you, and a historic perspective. So if you look at that top outline, it says the second coming of Christ. With the historic premillennial, the rapture and the second coming are simultaneous. That means they happen at the same thing. So example would be this right here. This is what we call a dispensational time chart. We have the Old Testament, we have the cross and what we call the church age. We have what we call the rapture, okay? Now, if a historic person is preaching the rapture, they're not meaning what you're thinking if you're dispensational. Are you with me? Say amen. Amen. Okay, this is for your learning, for your understanding. When a historic person talks about the rapture, they think the rapture happens at the second advent after the tribulation. So for them, the rapture doesn't happen 7 years before the tribulation, it happens after it. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you come into class, when we came 10 years ago, we were coming into a class that was teaching eschatology, the end time, and it took me several sessions just listening to people before I could understand where they were, because they were using terms and giving them meanings that were different from what I knew. See? And so that's what I want you to understand. So there is a difference in Christ's return when he comes. There's also a difference in the hermeneutic. If you look at the resurrection, there's the resurrection of the believers at the beginning of the millennium and a resurrection of unbelievers at the end of the millennium. So there's two resurrections there. When you look at a dispensational perspective, there's two different resurrections, but they happen in various stages. There's the church at the rapture, which again is different. There's the Old Testament saints, and then the tribulation saints at his coming, which is at the end. And then there's unbelievers at the end. So there's multiple resurrections to that first resurrection. Okay? Again, these are differences. For your information, so that you know. That's what this is for. That's the application. Okay? The judgments. The judgment at the second coming. The judgment is at the end of the tribulation. Right? It's at the end of the tribulation. There's a distinction in judgment. Believers are judged for their works at the rapture in 2 Corinthians 5 and Romans 14. There's the Jew and Gentiles at the end of the tribulation, and there's unbelievers at the end of the millennium. So there are various judgments at various times. They're not all linked into one judgment of all the saved at one time and all of the lost at another time, okay? The tribulation. Now look at this. The post-tribulation view, the church goes through the future tribulation. Now, I don't know if you know this, but if you look down at the bottom where it says Israel in the church, it says the church is spiritual Israel. You see that? That means when a historicist gets up and he preaches about the tribulation, and he preaches about Israel going through the tribulation or the church going through the tribulation, that's what they're talking about. They believe that the church will go through a tribulational period because Israel has its end in the church. There is no ethnic, distinct, individual purpose at the end of time for just Israel apart from the church. The church is Israel. So you have a post-tribulational view. The church goes through the future tribulation. So there's a different, what we call hermeneutic, or way that you study. And hang on, he's coming to you. Yes, sorry, I didn't bring that out. There we go. Sorry about that. So again, when we're looking about the judgment at the second coming, the judgment is at the end of the tribulation. And I have a time chart that Brian Chappell, he's a pastor, Presbyterian pastor, made, and I'll put that up for you to look at in just a minute. So the post-tribulational view, the church goes through the future tribulation. That means all those things that we were talking about before. Because Israel and the church are the same, they will go through the tribulation right here. They will see the wrath of God. They will experience the Six-Nation War. There will be a 75-day interval, all before the Messianic kingdom comes about. The church, if a historicist is getting up and preaching this, in their mind, you're going through those things. You understand that? You will go through the tribulation, the time of God's wrath, the Six-Nation War, all of those things. With a dispensationalist, you don't. You're raptured out before the tribulation ever begins. What I want you to see is there's a huge difference in both of these views, okay? The millennium, and this is an important one, the millennium is both present and future. Both present and future, right? Christ is reigning in heaven. The millennium is not necessarily 1,000 years. You don't have to believe that it's nearly 1,000, that it is essentially 1,000 years within that system. At the second coming, according to dispensationalists, Christ inaugurates the literal 1,000-year reign on the earth. So Christ has not already began his reign. He will begin it when he comes. Whereas the historicists say he's reigning now on the Messianic throne. You see that? And now, I don't know, I've mentioned this before, but you have Jesus as prophet, you have him as priest, and when you're talking about that, you're talking about what, 34 AD till now, where he's on his, where he's on his Father's throne with him, ever living to make intercession. And then one day when he comes to take up his kingdom, he will serve and reign as king. He has all authority, but he's not exercising it. See that? Now, here's the problem. What do you do with Christ on his priestly reign? If Christ went up and he sat on the throne, when he rose and ascended into heaven, where is his priestly reign? He's not doing anything. You've had him bypass his priestly duties to go and to sit upon the throne. So again, the kingdom is totally different here in the things that they're saying. And then, of course, there's a distinction, Israel and the church. There's some distinction between Israel and the church. There's a future for Israel, but the church is spiritual Israel. And again, that's what we said. When you believe that the church is the spiritual Israel, and you're trying to study that, and you're going back, What do you do with the rest of the covenants, their chastening, their conversion, their kingdom, and those who contend for that, right? So you see those differences there. Does anybody have any clarification or questions? Hang on just a minute, and they'll get the mic to you. And Andrew, by the way, I asked him earlier. He said he would answer any questions I didn't know the answer to. So we're glad he's here.
It's already on? Okay. Well, you can answer this next question. The first question, I got two things to say real quick. John MacArthur has described himself as a leaky dispensationalist. I'm not exactly sure what that is. But I've been just briefly looking, there's a few verses between the rapture and the second coming. The second coming in Malachi 4:5, and I think it's talked about right at the end of Revelation 2, the great and terrible day of the Lord when the moon be turned to blood. And Isaiah 13 is a good one too, about God's punishing the unjust in the second coming of the Lord. And it seems like in the rapture, like in 1 Thessalonians 4, it's talking about the Lord catching away his elect. Doesn't talk anything about judging the unbelievers at the rapture, but at the second coming seems to be more or less focusing on the punishing of the ungodly and the righteous that are left being saved. But more or less between the two, rapture's for us, second coming's for the unbelievers. And rapture's good for us, second coming's bad for the unbelievers, really bad.
Well, again, what I want you to see is the distinction in the teaching between these people, between George Ladd and between other people who are doing that. As a matter of fact, I don't really want to get into showing you that chart because that's going to go against what I want to do. Let me show you the timeline here. This may help you a little bit more. And again, I have several quotes, and all I'm doing with the people I'm going to give you quotes for is so you can tell that these people are teaching when I'm telling you they're teaching, okay? It's not so that I can tell you something and, oh, well, that's what Jeff said, so I'll believe him. I'm giving you what they say. This would be a historic pre-mill time scheme. It wouldn't be a dispensational one. It would be one that the historicists followed. There's the Old Testament prophecy, the cross, the kingdom is unfolding. Now, what kingdom that is? They say the Messianic kingdom. Christ is right now on the throne, and he's distributing gifts accordingly. This is big in the charismatic movement. I don't know if you know the tie between the charismatic movement, the Vineyard Church, the name it and claim it, and all of that sort of, but this is a big deal among them. So you have the kingdom unfolding. One day you're going to have an apostasy and a tribulation. There'll be wars and rumors of wars. That's where your tribulational period is. That's where your time of God's wrath is, and other things. After that time period, after the tribulation and all that, Christ comes down. He snatches his church up out, glorifies them all, brings them into the Messianic kingdom. What we're studying now is characteristics of that kingdom. Are we in that kingdom? And the things that we looked at in the kingdom suggest we're not in that kingdom at all, right? So you have the Messianic kingdom. It's followed by that Armageddon passage in Revelation chapter 20, after which time there's another resurrection, which I'm not sure who they're raising there because you have glorified believers already, but you have another resurrection, the judgment, and then at the end, then you have the resurrection of the lost in Revelation chapter 20, right? Is everybody clear on that? All right, so I hope that will help you in understanding what we're talking about here. There are huge differences between historic premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism. Let me give you just a couple quotes so that you know what people teach. This is George Eldon Ladd. But George Eldon Ladd says this, and notice what he says. He's a very, very good writer. The new redemptive events in the course of, and this term means salvation's history, it's a German term, have compelled Peter to reinterpret the Old Testament. Now, this is one of the things that they're big on. They like to change the Old Testament with the New Testament verses. So this is another method that they use that you have. So like I said, their hermeneutic is different, right? So because of the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, Peter transfers the messianic Davidic throne from Jerusalem to God's right hand in heaven. You see what he did? He changed the location. It's no longer in Jerusalem, 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Now it's in heaven. And it's no longer Israel, it's the church now that he's judging. And he's going to judge perfect people because they're glorified. See, so you have a lot of problems so far. So what he says here is Jesus has now been enthroned as the Davidic Messiah on the throne of David and is awaiting the final consummation of his messianic reign. This involves a rather radical reinterpretation of the Old Testament prophecies. These are his words. Okay? But no more than the entire reinterpretation of God's redemptive plan by the earthly church. In fact, it is an essential part of this reinterpretation demanded by the events of redemptive history. Jesus is enthroned as the Messiah, and he must reign until all enemies are made his footstool, which is a passage out of Hebrews chapter 2, which tells when he will be. Now, to help you understand that their hermeneutic is different, there's a guy by the name, well, there's several guys, but Darrell Bach, who is from Dallas, makes this statement, and he's one of these progressive dispensationalists, and he has a new hermeneutic, or a new way of studying. It's called the complementarian hermeneutic. And here's what it is. You have John Woolvard, who is dispensational. You have George Ladd, who is historic. And so what they do is they want to say, let's find, what is it? What do they want? The middle ground. And that's where you get these people from. They come up with all these middle ground perspectives constantly. You have to be very careful about some of these people. But this is what he says. The New Testament does introduce change and advance. It does not merely repeat the Old Testament revelation. In making complementary additions, however, it does not jettison the Old Testament promises. The enhancement is not of the expansion of the original promises. And so again, he develops his own hermeneutic to try to go along with what he was talking about earlier. You see that? And so those are some things that I wanted you to know, that I wanted you to be aware of as we're studying and as we're looking into the rest of this lesson. I hope that you'll understand that when you are listening to people teach, if they say they're premillennial, that doesn't help you. You have to know what type of premillennial they are. And when you know what type of premillennial are, you'll know the terms that they're using. Now, I don't know if any of you know that, if any of you thought about that, but there are many times that you'll hear many things, and sometimes you just want to maybe question those things, all right? Any thoughts or questions on any of that before I go any further? So when we're going back to these Old Testament descriptions that we've had before, we've looked at that God establishes this kingdom, and he tells us the day in which he does it during the days of the toes, the 10-toed nations. We see it's going to be an eternal kingdom. We see Christ will directly rule. We see that he will rule from the earth. We see that the land promises will be realized, and Israel will have the land that they were told, and they will be preeminent in that land. We see that in Isaiah 49, verses 22 and 23. There will be an immediate answer to prayer before you can even get the words out. Your prayers will be answered. There will be a messianic temple, which Messiah will build. You can see that in Zechariah 6, verses 12 and 13, where he combines the priestly and prophetic office. And then there will be the millennial David who will reign. And there's several passages we looked at that where David would reign. And that brings us up to this next point. And that is that it's going to be a righteous rule that Christ has, a righteous rule. Now, why will it be a righteous rule? So if we're talking about the Messianic kingdom, there's several places that we want to look at. Look at Daniel chapter 12. Let me give you a couple passages here. Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2. You can look at Isaiah 26 as well, but it's going to be a righteous rule because of the Old Testament saints being resurrected. By the way, if you look in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, it says, "At that time Michael will stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time, and at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting contempt, and those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteous like the stars forever." If you want to find one of the purposes of the tribulation, look down at verse 7. I wasn't going to say this, but it's right there, so I might as well just do it. "Then I heard a man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river. When he held up his right hand, his left hand toward heaven, he swore by him who lives forever that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time." And you notice that phrase is used over and over again. 42 months, 1,260 days, times, dividing of time. It is a literal 7-year period, we believe, according to dispensational thought. "And when the power," here it is, "and when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things will be finished." What is God doing? He's bringing Israel to nothing. He's bringing Israel to nothing, and that's what he'll do during that tribulation period. But when we're talking about this righteous rule, first of all, he's going to have Old Testament saints. This is after the tribulational period when God resurrects these Old Testament saints and they enter to the kingdom, right? Not only that, but it will be an environment where only believers will enter. Look at Matthew 25, and we can look at various passages, but, well, Ezekiel's a good one to look at. We can look at a couple. Look at Ezekiel chapter 20. That'll be a good one to look at. Ezekiel chapter 20, and look at verses 33 to 38. And we'll notice the phrase in verse 37, which is a passage that you want to look back at the book of Leviticus, chapter 27. It gives you sort of an explanation of what that phrase means if you want to look at it. So Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 33 to 30. "As I live, says the Lord God, surely with a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, and with fury poured out, I will rule over you." He's talking to Israel here, right? "As I live, says the Lord God, surely with a mighty hand, outstretched arm, with fury poured out, I will rule over you. I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you out from the countries where you were scattered. With a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, and with fury poured out, I will bring you into the wilderness of the people, and there I will plead my case with you face to face." Not something I would look forward to. "Just as I pleaded my case with your fathers in the wilderness in the land of Egypt, so I will plead my case with you, says the Lord God. I will make you pass under the rod and bring you into the bond of the covenant." And watch this, verse 38. Here's what he's doing. "I will purge the rebels from among you, and those who transgress against me. I will bring them out of the country where they dwell, but they shall not enter the land of Israel. Then you will know that I am Yahweh." See that? So God is going to bring them out and purge out from them the rebels. This passing under the rod, Leviticus 27, verse 32, had to do with the flock. He says, concerning the tithe or the herd of the flock, that whatever passes under the rod, that 10th one shall be holy unto the Lord. So it's a way of setting approval on people. You could see this in Matthew chapter 24, or 25, verses 34 and 41. Let me just show you a couple verses there, and we can move on. Matthew chapter 25, verses 34 and 41. And you're going to see the same word in both of these verses. Okay? Verse 31, "He'll send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the," I'm in chapter 24. Let me start in verse 31. "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, all his holy angels with him, he'll sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another as a shepherd divides the sheep from the goats. And he will set the sheep on his right and the goats on the left. Yeah, here it is in verse 34. Sorry about that. And then the king, then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you blessed of my Father, enter the kingdom prepared." This is a perfect tense verb, past, present, future. It's all going to happen. It was in the past, it remains in the present, and will continue in the future. "Come, blessed of my Father," talking about the sheep, "inherit the kingdom prepared for you from before the foundation of the world." See that? And then notice verse 41, what he says to the opposite group. Same word, same tense of speech, perfect tense. And he'll say to those on the left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." So again, we see both of these times, only believers will enter into the Messianic kingdom. Only believers will enter into the Messianic kingdom, right? Christ will rule righteously. We see that with Psalm 2:9, Zechariah 2:16, and chapter 19, verses 11 and 15, where the Bible talks about Christ is going to rule with a rod of iron out of his mouth. Now, he's going to rule over the unregenerate who are in their natural bodies that go into that Messianic, or who are born into that Messianic kingdom, to believers in their natural bodies already. And then thirdly, there's going to be the full knowledge of the Lord. And this is one that I think is really important that a lot of people miss, and I'm not sure why, but look at Isaiah 11:9. And you can look at Jeremiah, you can look at Zechariah, but let me look at just a couple passages here. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 9, and Hebrews 8 is a good passage. But Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 9, it says, "For they'll not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mount, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." And he talks about in that day the root of Jesse will be there and the Gentiles will seek after him. But notice what he says in Hebrews chapter 8. It goes right along with what he was just saying there. Hebrews chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. Let me just start in verse 8. "Because finding fault with them, he says, behold, the days are coming, says Yahweh." Now watch this. "When I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not according to the covenant I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they did not continue in my covenant, and I discarded them, says Yahweh. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my laws in their mind, write them on their hearts, and I'll be their God, and they'll be my people. None of them shall teach his neighbor, and none his brother, saying, know the Lord. For all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. I'll be merciful to their unrighteousness and their sins and lawless deeds." What does he say? "I'll remember no more." See that? So it'll be a resurrection of the Old Testament saints. Only believers will enter. Christ will rule with a rod of iron. The earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord. And again, all of these new covenant, this is a time when all these new covenant promises will be realized. You can see it back in Deuteronomy chapter 30 when we talk about the new heavens, or when we talk about the land promise. And you can see the repentance that goes on, and the return, and how they're regathered, and they're given the rebirth in verse 6. "And Yahweh your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live." And so this is the application of the new covenant, which we see in Zechariah chapter 12 that runs to chapter 13. So this is why it'll be a righteous rule in the kingdom. There will be sin, but Satan will be bound. The demons will be bound. Evolution will not be taught. Transgenderism will not be taught. None of those things will be taught. Only righteousness will be taught. So it will be a righteous rule. Now think about this. You're born to your parents who are God-fearing, God-loving people. You're in the midst of this place where Christ is ruling and reigning with the rod of righteousness. All sin is put down immediately. A person who is judged at an age of 100 is thought to die prematurely because of their sin. You don't know what sin is. You're in that system. How many people in their unregenerate self are going to be are going to be content by living in that condition? None of them. Because their heart is set on evil. You say, well, how do you get that number? Why do you think hardly none of them? Look at Revelation chapter 20, and let me remind you again of a number. And you can look at this and find it in different places, but in Revelation chapter 20, and I think it's, I have to find the verse there. Okay, verse 8. Beginning in verse 7, it says, now when the 1,000 years have expired, Satan will be released from his prison. He'll go out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth. Now this is after the Messianic kingdom. Gog and Magog gathered them together to battle. And now he's going to give you the number of those who are rebelling, whose number is as the sand of the sea. See that? Now I don't know how many people are as numbered as the sand of the sea, but that's quite a few. Yeah.
What I love too, Jeff, is that there'll be no elections. The rulers, the rulers are the rulers for the full 1,000 years. There's no turnover.
Anybody else? All right. Notice next then, the curse is to be curtailed. We see that in Isaiah chapter 65 and the various verses that are there, and we've looked at them before. Verse 20 and verse 22, I think, and I might have that I have it in my other notes, but if you look at it, Isaiah chapter 65, verses 20 and 22, you can see this very clearly. Isaiah 65, verses 20 and 22, and there's other passages. Obviously, Isaiah 35 deals with this as well. But if you look in Isaiah 65, verses 20 and 22, it says, no more shall there be infant of days, their life but a few days, nor an old man who has not fulfilled his days, for the child shall die 100 years old, but the sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed. Right? So they're going to be thought to die in infancy if they die at the age of 100. And here, the person dies because of their sin. So there is sin in the Messianic kingdom. You see that in Zechariah 14. You can see that with him ruling with the rod of iron. Again, remember, if Jesus is in the Messianic kingdom and all the believers are glorified, he doesn't have to rule them with a rod of iron. If the new covenant is application and you've received your glorified body and your glorified spirit, there's nothing that Christ has to rule over you with. You see that? That's why it's a righteous rule. It's a righteous rule in that sense, but there are unrighteous people in the kingdom. See that? All right. At verse 20 there, and then the other one would be verse 22. If you look at that, he says, and they will not build and another inhabit, they'll not plant and another eat. For as the days of a tree, you know how long trees live, so shall be the days of my people, and my elect shall enjoy the work of their hands. They won't labor in vain, and so on and so forth, and they'll be blessed. So what we see is that the curse here is curtailed. Remember, animal creation has been restored. We see that back in Isaiah 11, verses 6 through 9. The wolf will lay down with the lamb. We see creation is going to be restored. Right, and we see that in Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 22. And then here again, we see that believers or those people who are there are going to experience the curtailing of the curse. Right. Then there will be universal peace. You can see that back in Isaiah chapter 2 and various other places. But you know most of these verses. So if you look at them, Isaiah chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, many people will say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. This is the temple, to the house of the God of Jacob. So he identifies it, it's the temple. He will teach us his ways, and we'll walk in his path. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem. He'll judge between nations. He'll rebuke many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither will they learn war anymore. It'll be a time of perfect peace. And you see that all throughout the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 9:7, 11:9, 65:25, over and over again. You see it's going to be universal peace. It'll be a time of universal prosperity. I'm not sure how much of this you know, but look at Amos chapter 9, and that's a good place. Amos chapter 9, verses 13 and 14. You can look at Micah 4 and Isaiah 65 as well. But Amos chapter 9, verses 13 and 14. Behold, the days are coming, says Yahweh, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, the tender of grapes, him who sows seed. The mountain shall drip with sweet wine, and all the hills will flow with it. I will bring back the captives of my people Israel. They shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They'll plant vineyards and drink from them. They will make gardens and eat from them. I will plant them in their land. I will no longer shall they be pulled up from the land I have given them, says Yahweh your God. So God is going to prosper them in the end. See that? And then there's going to be, again, topographical changes. Now, I'm not sure how much you know about this or even looked at it, but you can look at Ezekiel. If you want to, that's a good place to look. Look at Ezekiel 47. Ezekiel 47 is a good place to look at. Now, remember, when we're talking about topographical changes in the topography, land, and all that, when you look at the tribulational period, in Revelation 6, 7 through 8, the fourth seal kills a fourth of the world's population. Now, do you take that literally or not literally? But if it kills a fourth of the world's population, there's a fourth of the world that just dies. The sixth seal, God's wrath opens up in Revelation 6, verses 12 through 17, where the people cry out and call for the mountains or the rocks to fall on them and kill them, right? You have the first through the fourth trumpets, where vegetation is destroyed in chapter 8, verses 5 through 11. And then in the sixth trumpet, a third of mankind is killed in chapter 9 and verse 15. Then there's an earthquake in chapter 11, verse 13, that kills 7,000. Those are just some of the notable topographical changes that will happen during the tribulational period. Well, have you seen any of those today? Maybe you're not in the tribulation. You need to be asking yourself these questions. What am I being taught? Am I in the tribulation? Am I not in the tribulation? Am I in the Messianic kingdom? Because I don't see any signs that the prophets have been given that are there. I'm not receiving immediate answer to prayer. The land isn't being possessed by Israel. They're not preeminent in the land. God hasn't established the land, and on and on and on it goes. Now, again, you can either take that literally or you can not take it literally. But when we go to the Messianic changes, we see all sorts of things happening. Look at Ezekiel chapter 47. And let me see if I can step this down to you. What's going to happen is God is going to take the waters from the Mediterranean Sea, create a river, and bring that water into the Dead Sea and make the Dead Sea alive again. And that's just what he's talking about here in Isaiah 47. He brings him back to the door of the temple. There was water flowing from underneath the threshold of the temple toward the east. For the front of the temple faced the east, and the water was flowing under the right side of the temple, south of the altar. He brings him out, verse 2, by the north gate, led him around outside to the outer gate and faces the east, and there was the water running out of the side. And when the man went out to the east, the line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits and brought me through the waters, and the water came up to my ankles. He measured 1,000 cubits and brought me through the waters, and the water came up to my knees. Again, he measured 1,000 and brought me through the water, and it came up to my waist. Again, he measured 1,000 cubits, and it was a river that I could not cross. For the water was too deep, water in which one must swim, a river that no one could cross. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? Then he brought me to the bank of the river, and when I returned, along the bank of the river were very many trees on one side and on the other. And he said to me, and I want you to watch this because this is going to flow into eternity. When he returned, verse 7 there, along the bank of the river were very many trees on one side and on the other. And he said to me, this water flows toward the eastern region, goes down in the valley, enters the sea. When it reaches the sea, its waters are Rapha, are healed. I am Jehovah Rapha, the Lord that heals you. See that? When it reaches its waters, they are healed. It'll be that every living thing that moves, whatever river it goes, will live, and there will be a very great multitude of fish, because these waters go there. For they will be healed, and everything that lives wherever the river goes. It'll be that the fishermen will stand in it by En-Gedi, which is by the Dead Sea, the west bank of the Dead Sea, by the Shittim Valley down there. And there will be places spreading for their nets. The fish of that kind will be the same kinds as the fish from the Great Sea, and that's the Mediterranean Sea, exceeding many. But its swamps and marshes won't be healed. They'll be given over to salt. And now watch what he says here. Along the bank of this river, on this side and that, will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, and their fruit will not fail. They will bear fruit every month. Why? Because their water flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be medicine, and their leaves for medicine. You see that? And that's what God is going to do. He's going to link, by this earthquake, and you can see that same thing in Zechariah chapter 14 and verses 4 and 5. In that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. This is verse 4, chapter 14. The Mountain of Olives shall be split in two from the east to the west, making a very large valley. Half the mountain shall be moved toward the north and half of it toward the south. See there? So he talks about this created valley being given for the people to flee through and to flee on. Not only that, but there will be abundant rainfall during this time. And you can see this in Zechariah 34. I realize we're doing a lot of stuff in Zechariah, but most people don't spend any time there. But look at Zechariah 34, verses 26 and 27. It's Ezekiel. I'm not sure. Did I say Isaiah? I meant Ezekiel. 34, verses 26 and 27. And I will make them in places all around my hill a blessing, and I will cause showers to come down in their seasons, and there shall be showers of blessing, and the trees and the field of the fruit, and the earth shall yield her increase. They shall be safe in their land, and they shall know that I am Yahweh, when I have broken the bands of the yoke and delivered them from the hand of those who enslaved them. So there'll be abundant rainfall. Isaiah says there'll be rainfall like water in the deserts in Isaiah 35, verse 6 and 7. He talks about physical healing going on there in Isaiah 35, verses 6 and 7, and how the sun will be brighter, 7 times brighter than what it even is now. Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 26, he says, I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations. Let me see. Let me get in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 26. It says, moreover, the light of the moon will be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun will be sevenfold as the light of 7 days. In that day the Lord binds up the bruise of his people and heals the stroke of their wounds. And so we see all of these things that will happen in the Messianic kingdom. When we look at those things, we have to ask, are those things happening now? Some would say yes, and some would say no, right? When we're looking at this, outline what we see. Some people, and if you go down to number 6 there, some people believe, and we'll get into this when we get into the kingdom, their kingdom itself, will babies and others with mental disabilities enter the kingdom? We'll have to wait and see. A text that they give is Zechariah 14. And then, of course, we don't have time, but you could go and look at how, and this outline is on your web page. Other believers that will enter the kingdom are believers only. Sin will be judged, the wicked will be destroyed, and Jesus will set and rule and reign upon his kingdom. Any closing thoughts or remarks in regard to any of that? All right, let me give you just again, one more thing, just to remind you, there is a difference between historic premillennialism and dispensationalism. It's for you to understand who's teaching what. Now, is it all right if I tell you what we were talking about earlier? That's fine. Andrew told me what I thought, and that was that the leadership for the most part is historic pre-mill, leans heavily toward the historic pre-mill. So when they're teaching you something, they're going to be teaching a historic pre-mill view. If you get somebody else who is more on the MacArthur stream, they're going to be teaching you a dispensational pre-mill. And so it's up to you to understand what view is being talked about while you're listening.